Donald Trump's threats to obliterate Iranian power plants if Iran doesn't open the Strait of Hormuz to shipping, well, they've now been put on hold. Iran has effectively closed this key oil route in retaliation for US and Israeli attacks, sending energy prices skyrocketing. The US president's threats had no discernible effect on Tehran's position, but did prompt them to warn that Tehran would respond to such an escalation by deploying naval mines into the Persian Gulf. Well, the Trump U-turn was announced not in a White House press release, of course, but via social media. Hours ahead of his previous deadline, the president wrote that the United States and Iran had held good and productive conversations. And he said that the threatened strikes had been postponed for 5 days. Except that Iran denies that any talks have taken place. Despite this, Trump's announcement caused oil prices to drop up to 10% at one point and stock markets to surge. Here's the president in his own words.
So they called. I didn't call. They called. They want to make a deal. And we are very willing to make a deal. It's got to be a good deal. And there's got to be no more wars, no more nuclear weapons. They're not going to have nuclear weapons anymore. They're agreeing to that. Any of that stuff, there's no deal.
The president acknowledged that a deal was not certain.
We have a very serious chance of making a deal. That doesn't guarantee anything. All I'm saying is we are in the throes of a real possibility of making a deal. And I think if I were a betting man, I'd bet for it. But again, I'm not guaranteeing anything. They want to make a deal very badly. Thank you.
So that's clear. Now, Avi Melamed is an independent intelligence analyst and a former Israeli intelligence official and founder of the ITME, Inside the Middle East Institute. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to DW. So we have the US president threatening another obliteration, then changing his mind after holding talks with Iran that Tehran said did not happen. Who are you believing in this scenario?
All of them and none. What we are looking at is part of what I have illustrated since day one of this war as the poker game. We are constantly looking at the different players involved in this poker game, and each one is trying to its best of capacities to first take advantage of the strong cards in its possession and at the same time to try to take leverage on the weak cards on the hands of the rivalry. So in the end of the day, I think that we could look at all these recent, I would say, couple of hours pendulum, so speaking, in the context of this poker game.
Okay, and this is normally how these sorts of negotiations play out, is it? You're a man who has seen, okay, we can lie, but we can lie strategically. We can say, we can tell a little bit of truth about this, or we can tell a little bit of truth about that. We can just lie about that, and everybody's playing the same game. Correct,
very correct. We could see it very clearly.
Right.
Every player leaves itself what we call a space for denial, sort of speaking, or a space for maneuvering, and this is exactly what we are seeing right now.
You talked about the cards that each has to play. What are the strong cards that Iran is playing? Clearly, the Strait of Hormuz is an ace that it's holding on to.
Yes, that's one of the cards, even though it has some kind of like a downsize in a way. But in addition to that, Iran has some other strong cards. For example, the fact that the Iranian regime has a very clear strategic objective, and that is to remain in power. And seemingly at this point, at least in the short future, is going to obtain that capacity, that objective. The second powerful card that the regime has in its possession is the fact that he doesn't care about his people. So the meaning of that is that the endurance capacity of that regime is much more bigger, I would say, in comparison, let's say, to the endurance capacities of its neighbors, the Arab Gulf states. The fact that the Mullah regime, as you mentioned earlier, accurately has control at the Hormuz Strait is, of course, another significant power card, and the fact that he can, and he has been doing since day one of the war, deliberately and intentionally targeting its neighbors, the Arab Gulf monarchies, and particularly focusing on the gas and oil energy infrastructure is deliberate, because the purpose beyond that is simply to create a global economic crisis, and thus through that to put pressure on the United States to stop the war.
It's very interesting, and this is a point that I've heard before, and it's good that you were clarifying it like that. So the Iranian objective is to stay in power. That's clear. Does that mean that this war ends only by negotiation or with the complete obliteration, to use Donald Trump's word, of that regime?
No, I don't think this war ends with complete obliteration. We have to be realistic. Iran is a huge state. It's a 90 million people nation. The Iranian regime, thus far, though sustained a significant damage, is still standing on its feet. So I think that we should be more realistic. I think that in the end of the day, we are heading towards some sort of like a diplomatic backtrack diplomacy that have to do in the end of the day with ending this crisis, this conflict, with some sort of like a diplomatic agreement.
If that happens, if Washington and Tehran do come to some sort of diplomatic agreement, do you think that will mean an end to Israeli strikes?
Yes. In the end of the day, when we are talking in the context again of the poker game, one of the most significant things that we have to be aware of is the fact that in the end of the day, Israel and the Arab Gulf monarchies that have been constantly threatened and attacked by the Mullah regime, in the end of the day must be tuned to the decisions that are done in the White House. And so once President Trump will call the day off, that means that both Israel and the Arab Gulf monarchies, of course, have to be on the same line with him.
Going back to the Strait of Hormuz question, why do you think Washington appears to have been caught so off guard by the Iranian decision to block the strait and send oil prices through the roof?
I don't know to say if they have been caught off guard. I think that this is something that probably was calculated within the different war scenarios that have been portrayed before the war started. I think that in a way, it seems like on top of priorities in terms of like the way that the American war planners were trying to assess what will be the Iranian move. There has been some good reasons for them to think that this card of the Hormuz Strait will not be necessarily the card Iran will rush to flush, sort of speaking, and to use. But we find ourselves in a situation where in the end of the day, the Iranians actually kind of like fulfill what they have threatened all the time, saying like, we will significantly damage world trade and particularly trade of the crude oil. Some 20% of the world's crude oil is going to this enormously strategic location. The Iranians fulfill what they have been threatening to do all those years. I think that this is something that has been viewed by the American side war planners as something that may happen down the road, and maybe there was some sort of like an estimation within the American war planners that given the magnitude of the early phase strikes and the severe damage caused to the Mullah regime and its infrastructure, we will not find ourselves in that position. Apparently, there has been some sort of like, let's call it miscalculation.
So let's look at that regional aspect of this war, because the conflict is now stretching across the Gulf as well as Israel and Lebanon. Is this a regional war in all but name?
Yes and no, because this is a war that in the end of the day, as you accurately mentioned, stretches beyond the physical dimension of Iran and the Arab Gulf monarchies. You mentioned Lebanon. This is very significant. There is something here we have to understand when we look at the large geostrategic picture of the region. The Mullah regime in Tehran has been leading a very aggressive expansion policy throughout the region during the last couple of decades, actually to a large extent occupying through network of armed armies like the Hezbollah or Hamas or Islamic Jihad, occupying large Arab territories. At some point, the Mullah regime actually had control over Iraq and Syria, Lebanon, Gaza Strip, and influence in Yemen. And so the Mullah regime has inflicted an enormous death and destruction across the region for the last couple of decades. And not less significant is the fact that while doing that, the Mullah regime remained totally immune from any repercussions and ramifications. As far as the Mullah regime is concerned, up until recently, the master plan of expansion and taking over the region was working very well at the service of the Mullah regime. The turning point was October 7 attack launched by Hamas that resulted in a domino effect, right, a chain reaction, if you wish. And now we are witnessing a very dramatic component of this chain reaction, and this is the war with Iran. So the weakening of the mullah regime, which is very clear what's happening right now. I'm not talking about downfall, but I'm talking about significant weakening of the mullah regime as in it for itself, could be a good news to the region, provided there will be a couple of things coming along with that. First, that the mullah regime will not have the ability, obviously, to break through to creation of a nuclear military capacities. The other thing is that the mullah's regime ballistic missiles industry will be some kind of like under monitoring. So to put it this way, the third thing, which is very significant, is to make sure that the proxies of the mullah regime will not be able to regroup themselves, and particularly when we are talking about Hezbollah. And one of the observations that I will offer is that once and even when the war with Iran is coming to an end, I think that we should expect the continuation of the war between Israel and Hezbollah.
Right.
The Israeli government is determined to end the threat that the Hezbollah presents to Israel. And by doing that, we could expect also, relatively speaking, hopefully, positive impact in the context of the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Okay, so let's finish where we started with these talks between Washington and Tehran that only one side say is happening. If you and I were to speak a week from now, following those talks/non-talks, what do you think the situation in Iran is most likely to be? What are we likely to be talking about a week from now?
A week from now, we are looking at the Iranian regime that finds itself, on the one hand, in an unprecedented situation in the sense that it has sustained a significant blow to its military capacities, to its military industry, an Iranian regime that still stands on its feet, but it's quite of like shaky, but still standing on its feet. An Iranian regime that is reminding you that Iran is dealing with an enormous inner challenges in addition to the war, economically, socially, and so on and so on. And an Iranian regime that is dealing with millions of Iranian people that loathe that regime. The big question, of course, is whether we are going to see the burst of the reignition of the Iranian uprising that we saw last January. It's an open question, but I think that will be the situation in Iran. So I think that it's very clear that the Iranian regime will try to, as soon as possible, to regroup itself, to reassure its control on the ground, yet it will be done in quite different conditions in comparison to the conditions before the war. And as I mentioned before, for the Iranian regime is definitely yet another significant milestone of exam, sort of speaking, regarding its ability to continue and to endure and to remain in power. I don't think that we should look, at least not in the foreseeable future, I don't think that we are looking at the downfall of the regime, but I think that we could expect some sort of like an inner political configuration within Iran because of the accumulation of all those circumstances and conditions I just mentioned. And I think that a desirable outcome and realistic outcome of such process would be a much more effective participation of large segments of the Iranian people who have been basically removed or remote from power, in the sense that it will kind of like result in maybe, hopefully, down the road, a creation of a new governmental system in Iran that will be, let's put it this way, much more cooperative and much less destructive than the mullah regime that took control over Iran in 1979.
Good talking to you, Avi. Thank you so much for joining us. Avi Melamed, independent intelligence analyst.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Mirzad Burajadi is an expert on Iran and Middle Eastern politics from Missouri University of Science and Technology in Rolla, Missouri. Welcome to DW. President Trump says there have been what he calls strong talks about a deal with Iran. Tehran said there have been no talks, and they accuse him of spreading fake news to calm the markets. Whom should we believe?
Right. There's a lot of confusion right now in terms of who is really to be believed here. I doubt that there are no discussions going on. Based on the reporting, it seems like some preliminary discussions apparently have been carried out through the Pakistanis as an intermediary. between the two sides. And yet, even if this is the start of negotiations, I think we should also keep in mind that we should not raise our hopes too high, because both sides are still quite separate and apart from each other in terms of what they want. President Trump mentioned wanting 12 demands from Iran, and simultaneously, if the negotiations start, the Iranians are also going to be articulating demands of their own, which are going to be quite serious. And we have to see whether there is a political appetite for the two sides to really reach a rapprochement, which will be somewhere in the middle.
Well, do you think Iran's leadership would be secretly happy if they could reach a deal, stop the bombing, and remain in power?
Absolutely. I think for the Iranian success basically means no regime change, right? They realize that, look, they have a brand new supreme leader who is a novice, apparently has been wounded, and this guy needs to be able and to assert his authority on the one hand. On the other hand, it's also important to keep in mind that the Iranians are going to inherit a system where a lot of the basic infrastructure of the country, from the military installations to the bureaucratic ministries and so forth, have all been damaged in a country that even before the war started was facing shortages of water and electricity and so forth. So the art of statecraft is going to become that much more difficult for the Iranian regime as this war continues. And yet, on the other hand, we can also understand why they are not necessarily in a hurry to end this war, because they think, what's the point if they are going to be attacked 3 months, 6 months from now, once again by the Israelis or the Americans?
I wanted to ask you about this, because there seems to be no way. Every way out of this looks extremely messy. And you touched on the idea of this new leader. It's going to be an odd leader whose first big action is to capitulate to the American devil and give them what they want in order to stay in power. Because it looks like after you've done that, as I think you were starting to hint at, after you've given the Americans what they've said they want, well, you are then fighting off the various factions within your own government in a country that is on its knees economically.
Well, my sense is that if there is going to be a, off-ramp, it should be one that allows both sides to save face. In other words, the Iranians need to get something in return that the new supreme leader can sell to his constituency as a success. So, for example, let's say sanctions relief, releasing Iranians' frozen assets, might be ways that, they can agree to. Also, keep in mind that they do not need to necessarily have an official ceasefire. It can be a de facto ceasefire that the two sides agree to. Then they engage in a series of confidence building measures, right, before they can reach a de-escalation agreement of some sort. So, no, I think, if the mindset of the Trump administration be what it is so far, right, which has been full surrender of the Iranians, we are seeing, the last 4 weeks should be a very strong indication that the Iranian sense of national pride, the strength of their military, etc., should demonstrate that this is no Venezuela and that they're going to be fighting back.
And what of the Americans, though? Does Donald Trump need an off-ramp from this conflict that has turned out to be more trouble than he expected?
Absolutely. I mean, look at the strange relationship between him and his NATO partners. Look at the pressure that the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf are putting on him in regard to the continuation of this war, because, as we have seen, Iran has managed to fire missiles and drones at 11 of its neighbors, which is no small, task. And therefore, they have managed to increase the economic cost for President Trump. So even releasing, oil from the strategic reserves has not managed to bring down the price of oil. Same type of things is happening in the gold market and so forth, We are entering, into the summer months where traffic and traveling will be at a premium, and therefore, as well as the American midterm elections. So all those factors combined also puts pressure on President Trump to try to do something about the affordability that the American public has to deal with at the gas pumps and the like.
Good talking to you. Thank you for taking us through that so clearly. Mirzad Bourajedi from the Missouri University of Science and Technology. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we can talk about this now with Mark Kansian. He's a former U.S. Marine colonel and is now a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to the program. Mark, over the weekend, the U.S. president threatened to obliterate Iran's energy infrastructure if it didn't fully open the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours. Now Donald Trump has extended that deadline for 5 days. What do you make of his threat and then this sudden deadline extension?
Well, the threat came from the president's frustration that he believes that he's winning the war. In fact, he believes that he's nearly won the war. He sees that the United States has destroyed the Iranian Navy, destroyed its Air Force, has flattened its ballistic missile production, attacked its nuclear capabilities. But still, the Iranians have not agreed to his terms. So he was escalating to put more pressure on them. And then we get this news that there's perhaps a peace deal or at least some negotiations going on.
The U.S. is lobbying other countries, too, for help in getting the Strait of Hormuz reopened for shipping, above all, for vital oil shipments. How viable is the prospect of getting ships safely through the strait without Iran's cooperation?
Well, it's certainly possible. The United States has a lot of military capability in the theater, but opening the straits would be a major military operation on its own. The United States would have to escort any ships entering. They would have to do sweeping for mines, probably bring in Marines to secure some of the islands in the straits. They would have aircraft overhead attacking any Iranian forces that fired, probably U.S. Army forces ashore, maybe on the Oman Peninsula, helicopters, air defense. So it would be a major operation, and there would be casualties. But I think that the United States could push through.
And it would be expensive. Waging war is expensive. You worked in the U.S. federal government yourself on defense budget strategy and war funding. What can you tell us about the financial costs that the U.S. military is incurring in this war?
Well, the financial costs to date are probably a little over $20 billion. We did several estimates on the costs of the war. Very costly first couple of days. Then the United States was able to switch to lower cost munitions, but still running $400 million, $500 million a day. There are, in addition, a variety of economic costs, as we heard, costs to the world economy, costs to the U.S. economy. Those aren't part of DOD's budget costs. DOD has requested $200 billion, but that's not just for the war. It's mostly to build military capabilities for a variety of needs, including China.
Does a war like this one that the U.S. and Israel are waging against Iran affect the readiness of the U.S. military to deal with threats in other theaters like the Pacific?
Well, there are near-term and longer-term costs and gaps. The near-term gap is the fact that the only carrier at sea in the Pacific was sent to the Middle East. That was the Lincoln and its battle group. The Marines who were afloat in the Western Pacific have also been sent to the Middle East. There have been some air defense units, some THAAD units, and some munitions sent to the Middle East. So there's a near-term vulnerability. And when the war is over, units will go back. That will go away. There is some longer-term gaps, and that arises from using munitions, particularly a handful of very scarce but needed munitions, air defense, missile defense, particularly.
Yes.
You hear a lot about that also.
I wanted to ask you specifically about that because Iran has been very effective in using cheap drones and missiles to attack targets and trigger interceptors that are proportionally much more expensive. How much of a problem is this asymmetric tactic for the U.S. and other countries like Ukraine that rely so heavily on U.S. military equipment?
Well, you have to keep in mind that Patriots, which are quite expensive, they run $3 million a missile, are only used against Iranian ballistic missiles and not used against the cheap drones. The United States does have some inexpensive counters to these drones, some called Coyote, Roadrunner, APKWS, but the United States does not have enough of those. It started building that capability seriously when the Ukraine war began. The United States and the allies in the Gulf have had to use more expensive munitions, not Patriots, but munitions like AIM-9 or AIM-120 that cost maybe $500,000 or in some cases even $1 million each. They haven't had to use a lot of those, but more than they would like.
Mark, thank you very much for your insights. That was Mark Kansian from the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Thanks for having me on the program.
Well, gas pumps are one of the first places that consumers are feeling the pinch of the war-induced energy crisis. Increases in fuel prices have varied from country to country with knock-on effects feeding through to the rest of the economy. Our report looks at the situation in different parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia.
With fuel prices rising, drivers in Germany say they're now taking their cars out as little as possible.
I didn't used to. I used to drive my kids to a lot of places. Now I can't afford that.
In other parts of Europe, people are crossing borders, trying to catch a deal on gasoline. Portuguese drivers like this man are now coming to Spain, where the government pushed through an emergency package, lowering taxes on fuel.
This war is a political crisis, and we see it's never going to end. We don't have bombs, but we do have high prices for everything.
Slovenia is now limiting how much fuel people can buy to stop hoarding. And neighboring Croatia is urging its citizens against panic buying.
We must be aware that we are facing the biggest energy crisis in history. Use energy sources optimally, rationally. I urge people not to stock up, not to buy energy supplies irrationally.
Across Africa, economists warn that the upward pressure on fuel prices is dragging the economy down. Business owners here in Nigeria say it's getting harder to buy all kinds of supplies.
Increase of the fuel has affected our production, everything.
People in Asia are also feeling the crunch. In Taiwan, taxi drivers say they're losing a chunk of their earnings.
Of course, it's a big impact. We're out driving every day. The fuel prices have gone up so much, and we're really losing out.
China, which tightly controls fuel prices, is now raising the price cap for the second time since the war began. And countries with tight supplies are worried about fuel being smuggled abroad. Authorities in Thailand, near the Myanmar border, seized 20,000 liters of diesel from this warehouse. They say to stop it from being exported illegally.
The head of the International Energy Agency has warned that the energy crunch that is resulting from this Gulf War could rival that of the oil crisis in the 1970s. But is the situation really so dire? That's the question I put to Christophe Ruhl, an economist at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy.
I don't want to sweet talk the seriousness of the moment, but I don't think these comparisons are quite accurate. He compared the disruption in the 70s with the one we have today. The oil market is about twice as big, so its disruption of the same size is about half as big. Plus, in the 70s, this was for many weeks and months, and this so far here has been taken only a few weeks. I think it is accurate to say if the situation continues with the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz and with the fear of physical destruction of production facilities, it will get to the most serious situation we've ever seen. But that's true of many crises before. As it is right now, the way I would describe it, we are still on the right side of the Rubicon, so to speak. So if the world would return to peace tomorrow, prices would mitigate again, and there would be no lasting damage, at least in oil markets, because there have been no lasting damage to production facilities as of yet. And so I wouldn't, we are not at a situation where there are queues in front of the gas stations around the globe and where people have to walk on Sundays on the highway, on the Autobahn. We are still in a situation where taxi drivers, as per your report, complain that they lose earnings. That's serious, but that's not the end of the road yet. So in that sense, I would put some sort of oil on the water.
So you're saying there are no lasting effects yet, but the Qataris are saying that their LNG facilities, processing facilities, have been damaged and could take years to replace that capacity. Just as an example, there are multiple examples of how this crisis is already impacting the world, whether it's the consumers or stock markets. Were these effects foreseeable?
It is correct that there are these effects. Just one footnote, Qatar produces 20% of global LNG, and they say their production damages 17%, so that's 4% of the global. Also an explainer why gas prices are by far not at levels at which they were in 22 when Russia cut its imports into Europe. These effects have been foreseeable, and it's mind-boggling to me as an economist busy with energy for a long time, how you could possibly do something like militarily attack Iran without safeguarding the Strait of Hormuz. Every oil analyst, everyone really in the business for the last 40 years would have pointed out that this is the main choke point, one of the two main choke points in the world, and that one should be very careful in how to handle that situation. It is almost inconceivable to me that how this military sort of activity could have started without developing safeguards for the situation. And if that situation continues, and in particular, if the fear realizes that production facilities are damaged, either because they have to be closed or because they are attacked, then of course the situation can get out of hand very easily, very dramatically, and that explains the sense of panic we all have and the rise in prices of 50% in oil, which we've seen.
Different parts of the world have different levels of exposure to this energy shock, let's say. Which countries stand to lose the most, and will there be any winners?
So far, there is one clear winner emerging, and that is Russia, because Russia had just faced the situations where sanctions were tightened and a situation where low oil prices had led to considerable difficulties in their budget. Russia had just decided to sequester 10% of its budget expenditures, means to cut its government budget by 10%. And obviously, this would have hit the civilian population, not the military. And now, the ships which were circling on the oceans and trying to find a home after sanctions had been tightened are now redirected to China and India with impunity. And the oil they carry has just increased by 50%. That's the sole big winner which we can see. Losers are the poorest countries who are dependent on gas and oil imports, Bangladesh, Pakistan, many countries in Southeast Asia, and highly industrialized economies on islands with little storage. That's in particular Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. And with it, of course, is a threat that the crisis spreads, because this is where, for example, semiconductor production is concentrated for artificial intelligence project, which is also very energy intensive.
And of course, there's helium that's needed in some of that high-tech production as well that's affected with this blockage. What about the United States? It's become a net exporter of oil and gas in recent years. Why are energy prices there rising as much as they are?
I'm speaking to you from Houston, where there's a big annual jamboree of the global energy people working in the global energy markets. The sense of exuberance and optimism is still palpable here, and that is largely in the wake of the Trump administration shifting the conversation on energy from worries about climate change and about energy supplies to an outlook to the world which says we need to produce as much as possible because that helps the economy and helps all of us. That shift is still there, and the tone of optimism is still there very strongly, I would say. The US, however, is affected by rising prices, and that manifests itself in rising gasoline prices at the pump. And the reason is that all markets are a global market. You have to imagine that system almost like a bathtub with several access flows and several flows leaving the bathtub, and the water levels there move all together. And so what happens in one part of the world in restricting access to oil supplies affects all parts of the world in the availability of oil and therefore in prices. Now, the US is one thing. They can probably, like Western Europe, live with these higher gasoline prices for a while without an economic crisis. The politics of the US are another thing. And this is, I think, where a lot of the explanations may come from for this slightly erratic policy of the current administration, because they face, as you know, midterm elections in October, and prices on the pump, gasoline prices, are one of the key issues President Trump has always emphasized again and again as crucial for his election campaign. And there, it doesn't look very good at the moment.
Christoph, thank you very much for talking with us again. That was Christoph Rühl, economist and from Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy.
Thank you for having me.